themselves to take advantage of this trend are going to be big economic winners. When it comes to energy specifically, offshore wind represents possibly one of the biggest job and economic development opportunities for a state like Virginia. A recent study by the U.S. Department of Energy estimates that under a moderate growth scenario, not a high growth scenario, but a moderate growth scenario, offshore wind will support 175,000 jobs in the U.S. by 2030. Double that in a high growth scenario, with more of those jobs on the Atlantic coast than anywhere else in the country. The first decisions about where the manufacturing facilities, the construction facilities, the staging facilities for this new offshore wind industry, the first decisions about where those are going to be placed are probably going to be made during this next governor's term. Virginia has huge competitive advantages in this area. A world-class port, maritime workforce, strong manufacturing base, but without leadership from the top, other states will be more than happy to attract those jobs away. So I sort of look at this trend towards growing use of renewables. The analogy I like to use is it's a train, and the train is leaving the station. We have three options. We can either get on board as a passenger, we can be left behind at the station, or we can get up front and drive. And I hope we have some drivers here today.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Eric Melito. Eric is Director of Upstream and Industry Operations for the American Petroleum Institute, or API, which is a national trade association representing over 500 companies involved in all aspects of the oil and gas industry. This includes exploration, production, refining, and transportation. Eric's work covers regulatory and legislative matters related to domestic exploration and production, including access to domestic oil and natural gas resources, both onshore and offshore. Please welcome Eric.
Thank you, Randall. I'd like to thank George Mason and the Consumer Energy Alliance for having us. It's a privilege to be up here with Randall, Eddie, and Brian. And Brian really lays out the key aspect of this is that we are an all-of-the-above country when it comes to energy. If you look today at what the Department of Energy's statistics show, that we use all of the above, and as we move forward, we're going to use a lot more oil, natural gas, coal, and renewables when we become a nation that's heading into the future. Today, we're at about 62% with our energy coming from oil and natural gas. But when you look out to 2040, even with significant increases in renewables and low carbon emitting fuels, we're still going to be nearly at a 60% level when it comes to utilizing oil and natural gas for our economy, when it comes to driving our cars, running our manufacturing facilities, fueling our economy in general. It's going to be really driven still by oil and natural gas. And right now we're going through a huge energy resurgence as a country. In 2009, we were producing about 5 million barrels a day in this country. By the end of next year, it's going to be over 8.5 million barrels a day, getting close to 9. And the counter to that, and the good story behind that, is we're going to be going from 10 million barrels of imports per day down to about 7. So we're looking at a huge renaissance here in this country that's occurring both onshore and offshore. And we are now the world's largest natural gas producer. That's helping us to drop our carbon emissions down to some of their lowest levels since the 90s because we're using more natural gas in generation of electricity. And then we're also looking to become the world's largest producer of crude oil by 2020. And that's a great story because it's helping us from an energy security, a national security standpoint, and the jobs and the government revenues also come along with that. But we can do much more. If you look at the United States, we have about 87% of our offshore areas are right now off limits to development. We're one of the few nations in the world that actually does that. If you look at Canada, just off the coast of Nova Scotia, which is right next to Maine up there, they're developing some large gas fields, and they're now doing exploratory work for crude oil deposits in the subsalt formations. Cuba is also allowing development in its offshore waters, and there's been several wells drilled off the coast of Cuba, very near Florida. So we as a country have to decide, okay, we need oil and natural gas as we move forward. We know that there is natural gas, and we understand that there could very well be a lot of oil deposits off the coast in the Atlantic. Should we move forward and determine that we should develop that? Well, if we as a country make the decision that we move in that direction, particularly looking at the areas that have been off limits, both onshore and offshore, we could create 1 million jobs in under a decade, and we could bring in $127 billion in government revenues in under a decade. That's looking at all the places that are off limits right now, onshore and offshore. And to balance that, we're moving forward in a way that shows it can be done safely and environmentally responsibly because of the advanced technologies, and a lot of the steps have been made by the federal government and state governments, both onshore and offshore. So I think as a country, we have a great story to tell in terms of energy development. Many other countries from around the world will look at us, and they come here to find out how we're doing it so that they can emulate what we're doing here. And it puts us in a good position as a nation to be more competitive globally from an energy standpoint. I'm happy to be part of this discussion and willing to continue this dialogue. So thank you, Randall.
Thank you, Eric. I think you can't talk. Go ahead, give him a round of applause. He worked hard to get here today, I know. But I think you cannot talk about developing energy, whether it be the traditional or the non-traditional off the coast of Virginia and the Atlantic coast, without first being talked about safety. Safety for the environment, safety for the workers, safety for the existing businesses. I think we'll go in reverse order. Eric, would you like to address that question of safety and how to develop oil and gas?
Yes, since 2010, since the tragic event that occurred in the Gulf with the Macondo spill, there have been numerous extensive changes to both the regulatory structure and the way the industry operates. And they're in 3 areas. We see that we need to have a strong 3-legged stool. I'm sitting on a 4-legged stool, but one leg is prevention, the other leg is intervening and being able to cap and shut in a spill event in the event one actually would occur, and then the 3rd leg is spill response. Each of those areas has been advanced tremendously through both industry actions and through the government's steps it's taken in regulation. On a prevention side, the industry has set up something called the Center for Offshore Safety, and it's designed to bring everybody together to have a focal point that really looks at safety systems and building up safety culture. In parallel to that, the government now requires every company to have a robust safety and environmental management system, a SEMS, in place. That was actually in the works in 2009 and 2010 prior to the spill even occurring. They've come out with 2 rules on that, an initial rule and then a follow-up, a SEMS 2 rule. The industry is also come out with enhanced standards when it comes to drilling deep water wells, when it comes to the equipment, how you design the equipment, how you operate your equipment, use the safety systems, when it comes to the safety, critical safety equipment being used. And then those are now also part of the regulations. The industry works very closely with the offshore regulator to make sure that we have consistency in the standards being developed and the regulations that are in place. So prevention has been a really large focus of it. And then we've seen 2 companies that have been created, the Marine Well Containment Company and the Helix Well Containment Group. If you're going to drill a well in the offshore, in the deep water, you now have to show that you're a member of one of these companies, or that you have the ability to get one of these huge capping stacks, so that in the rare event that there would be a spill, you can get the capping stack. It's available within 24 hours. You get it out there within a few days, and you can shut the well in. Those are now available. Each company has 2 capping stacks, and they have logistics in place so they can get out there and deploy them. The 3rd area is spill response. There are companies called Oil Spill Response Organizations, or OSROs, and they have enhanced their capabilities so that they have additional equipment in place to be able to get out there and respond to a potential spill event. And those latter 2, the intervention with the Marine Well Containment Company and Helix Well Containment Group, and the spill response, those have also been incorporated into the way the regulations have been developed, because they have new requirements for how you calculate what kind of spill event could occur, which has driven up the amount of equipment companies must have. So what I would say is a lot of this good work has been done for a long time. API has developed standards for decades, and the companies have been utilizing them. But we've stepped up our efforts, and we now have a very robust system in place that filled any potential gaps that there were, and has put in a strong system of prevention, intervention, and containment and response in the event that we could have a spill. But the number 1 element of those 3 is prevention. 99% of the effort goes into prevention to make sure we don't have that event. And I think we're in pretty good shape right now with the offshore operating environment. And the other thing I would add is, the industry's drilled close to 50,000 wells offshore, many of them in deep water. The track record is pretty good, and we hope to never have one of those again, given the level of standardization and regulation we now have. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, for most of the United States, certainly offshore, wind farms are maybe on the planning books. They certainly aren't a reality yet. And we don't often hear safety issues talked about when we discuss wind farms and more non-traditional forms of energy. Could you enlighten us on some of the issues that you've been studying about safety and wind farms? And always throwing jobs and safety go together. And if you'd like a chance to address that as well.
Yeah, I mean, worker safety is a big concern for the offshore wind industry as well. Whenever you're dealing with large, heavy equipment in an offshore environment, worker safety is of top priority. But I would say that the relative shortness of my answer to this question also sort of speaks to one of the differences in the risk profile, and that's you don't have the risk of catastrophic environmental damage with offshore wind as you do, however remote, with oil and gas. So, every energy source has its pros and every energy source has its cons, and we should get to the pros and cons of all of them. But I think safety is a huge concern, but I think it's more focused on the worker safety side of things.
All right, thank you. Eddie, again, we talked about seismic a little bit. There's certainly been some discussion of the safety of seismic work and how it affects marine mammals. Would you mind addressing that?
Absolutely. Our industry has taken steps to ensure that we do as little harm to the environment as possible. Our equipment has passive acoustic monitoring devices that listen for any mammals in our zone. We have MMO, marine mammal observers on all our vessels. And when we start an operation, our underwater acoustic devices are not charged at full charge, that we ramp up slowly so that any wildlife in the area gets an indication that there's going to be some noise in the area, allowing them to leave before we fully ramp up and start our operations. I can also tell you that last month when we were shooting our seismic off the coast of Uruguay, our marine mammal observers noticed penguins in the area. And our crew shut down for 3.5 days because they wouldn't leave the zone. Our industry is very sensitive to the marine mammals. We don't want to do any damage. We just want to collect the scientific information and provide it to the industry and the government. Thank you.
Eddie, has there been any documented evidence of harm to marine mammals from seismic work?
I've not seen any in any of the studies internationally or domestically, Randall. No known acoustic, auditory, or physical damage to any marine mammals as it relates to the seismic activities.
All right, thank you. Another issue when we talk about Virginia and offshore certainly is the compatibility with military operations, compatibility with, again, beach-going operations, compatibility with recreation. Brian, would you take the first shot at how does the wind industry work with the military, the coastal communities to make sure that there aren't any conflicts?
Yeah, there's a pretty robust siting process when it comes to siting offshore wind energy projects, and specifically here in Virginia, the Department of Interior, through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, has been working for several years with the Department of Defense, with the Coast Guard, with the Virginia Port Authority, with a whole list of stakeholders in the state and federally to identify those areas that might have some conflicts and identify the areas that have little conflict and are potentially suitable for development. That process has pretty well run its course, and the area off the coast of Virginia that is suitable for development has been identified. And as a matter of fact, next week will be the offshore lease sale for that area for offshore wind energy development. So we're seeing real progress in wind energy here in Virginia, and the military has been part of this process the whole time.
Brian, can you give us an idea of the size of a typical offshore wind farm? Maybe talk about Europe right now, if you have any experience, or what is expected off the coast of Virginia.
Yeah, I think what we're likely to see in Virginia first, the first steel in the water we'll see is a MET station on the Chesapeake Light Tower that's actually going to be a national reference station for collecting meteorological data. Dominion Power, the utility in Virginia, is now working on a demonstration project where they will put out 2 6-megawatt turbines as a technology demonstration and cost reduction initiative. And then it's likely that the first commercial scale projects would be on the order of probably 350 up to 1,000 megawatts, probably somewhere in the middle of that would be a likely range. And so in that range, you're talking about maybe 100 turbines offshore.
All right, thank you. Eric, what does the oil and gas industry do to avoid conflicts with military as well as other uses?
Well, there's an extensive process that the government goes through when it comes to conducting NEPA work, environmental reviews, putting the environmental impact statements together. But harkening back to your experience as director of the MMS, these agencies, government agencies, do not operate in a vacuum. The Department of the Interior works very closely with the Department of Defense. And when a company, we call them operators, goes out there and gets a lease, this is a contract, and the contractual terms actually stipulate that anything they do has to be done in coordination with the Department of Defense to make sure it is compatible and it will not interfere with military activities. So there are many ways that it's addressed, but it's really through the agencies working together. And as you see with the lease sale that was proposed for Virginia originally, lease sale 220, that was taken into account. They created a lease sale area that started out 50 miles off the coastline. It looked a bit of like a triangle, but it had buffer zones so that we would have the ability for naval and marine traffic to be able to move in and out from the coastline. But it also incorporates the stipulation of terms that make it clear to an operator that anything they do has to be coordinated with the Department of Defense so that there is no interference with military operations. And the history in the Gulf of Mexico has proven that. We've been developing the Gulf of Mexico for over 50 years, and it's been very successful in working with the Department of Defense to make sure military activities continue without impact.
All right, thank you. We're running out of time. Eddie, you may get the last shot. Ah, lucky you. But just a quick question on one, what are people going to see as seismic operations are being conducted? And what is the status of seismic information off the coast of Virginia or the Atlantic coast? And what needs to be done in order to get new data?
Right now, we're waiting on a record of decision from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management on the Atlantic Programmatic Environmental Impact Study. It was initially supposed to be out in October. They've put on their website that it's slipped to the end of the year, and we've got a good account that it's actually been slipped to March 31st of next year. So we can't begin to file a permit until there's this record of decision. The permit process is another year. So the seismic I'm talking about acquiring off the coast of Virginia won't happen now until at least 2015, and that's if there's no further delays with the bone.
All right. Let's give our panel 5 minutes. Wait a minute, wait. He's giving me another 5 minutes. All right, we're doing all right. Yes, Eric, I was just going to say, you've got 5 minutes to add some concluding remarks.
No,
Eric?
I just want to do concluding remarks, but I did want to add on to that. There's a interesting debate going on about seismic and leasing. And what we heard from the new Secretary of the Interior, Secretary Jewell, is that once they have the data, then they'll look to include offshore areas based upon this data, which could show that there are geologic formations which could contain oil or natural gas. But I'll caveat that they show what the formations look like, but you really need to test the formation by doing an exploratory well to see if there's oil or natural gas really there. The fact that this has been delayed and could be pushed out past 2015 could make it very difficult to have any offshore leasing occur really before 2022. And the reason why I say that is because if you want to have a lease sale in an offshore area, it has to be included in a 5-year leasing plan. The current plan runs out in 2017, and there will be a new one that will run from 2017 to 2022. If the Atlantic is not in there, then we would not have a lease sale in the Atlantic until at least 2022, unless Congress would intervene and say you must have one. But I say that because the indications are, without this information, which is being delayed, Interior may or may not include these areas for leasing, which is of significant concern because we're looking at the long term when we're looking at energy security. If the production we have today is because of decisions that were made 10 years ago. If we're not making those decisions now to at least explore in the Atlantic, it could be a long time that we're looking into the future before we actually have that opportunity. So delay is huge, and what happens is you end up seeing investment go to other parts of the world because these companies don't operate just in the United States. I just want to add that. That's a very key delay that we're looking at in terms of putting off that seismic research. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple more items. Eddie, the seismic work necessary for wind farm siting.
Absolutely. We have to collect the high-res, shallow seismic data for these guys to put their installations into the subsurface of the marine. So the collection of that seismic is vital to give us an understanding and to make sure that we're putting those installations in the correct places.
Thank you. Brian, in realistic terms, when do you think Virginia might see its first wind farm off the coast?
I think we could see the demonstration turbines by 2016 timeframe, and first commercial scale probably 2018 to 2020. So, you know, things are moving, and if I could, I'd like to just add one additional point to put sort of, you know, we talk a lot about the jobs in this industry, and that's a big driver for this, and I just wanted to kind of put that in context. Virginia has, in total developable area, about 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts of potential, and that probably doesn't mean a lot to you, but go with me here for a second. If you add,
it's a lot of light bulbs, right?
It's a lot of light bulbs. It's a lot of light bulbs. If you add in just the rest of the Mid-Atlantic states, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, there's about 17,000 megawatts of developable potential without conflicts. The amount of steel required just for the foundations to develop 17,000 megawatts is equivalent to 56 Nimitz-class aircraft carriers. That's just the foundations, and that's just the Mid-Atlantic states. If you look south, that's 17,000 Mid-Atlantic. North Carolina alone has twice that amount. So there is a lot of opportunity here in terms of jobs and economic development.
All right, thank you. And I think they have cut me off for sure this time. Let's give the panel a round of applause.
Thanks, Randall and panelists, for getting us off to a great start this morning. Let me now welcome Terry McAuliffe to George Mason University. Mr. McAuliffe is a businessman, entrepreneur, and a dad who's lived in Fairfax County, Virginia for over 20 years. He's the son of Jack McAuliffe, who was an Army captain in World War II, and Millie McAuliffe, who raised Terry and his three brothers. As the youngest kid growing up in a middle-class family, Terry knew he would have to pay his own way through college, so at the age of 14, he started a business paving driveways for neighbors and local businesses. Since then, he has worked with and led numerous businesses in diverse sectors of the economy, helping to improve companies and create economic opportunity. Mr. McAuliffe attended Catholic University and Georgetown Law School. He and his wife Dorothy were married in 1988 and have made Virginia their home for 20 years because it's where they wanted to raise their children. They've attended St. Luke Catholic Church for 2 decades. They've been involved in every sport, activity, and competition imaginable. With 5 kids, and I imagine that's every night of the week, every week. Yep. So welcome, and we're really looking forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. It is an honor for me to be with you today. It was great to be back. I think it was last October I spoke to you, and it's great to be back in less than a year. I would like to thank the Consumer Energy Alliance for inviting me here today, and I also want to thank George Mason University. Let's give George Mason a great round of applause for hosting us today. It's great to see such a great group of business leaders and entrepreneurs here today. I look forward to hearing from you. I look forward to the questions and answers. As I travel all around Virginia, I've spent a lot of time listening to the concerns of entrepreneurs and business leaders on how we're going to work best to expand our economy and grow and diversify a 21st century economy. Most importantly, how do we start new businesses? As many of you know, I did start my first business when I was 14 years old. I either started a business or I may not have been able to go to college. I had to help pay for college. I started out, I remember like it was yesterday, I was walking home, I've been caddying bags all day, going up and down hills for 5 hours, and made $8. Walking home, figured I'd throw my life away. I said, I have to start my own business. And I saw a guy out sealing his driveway with that hot tar liquid. I said, you know what? They'll hire a young kid to do that. I went out home, typed up a letter. I had 10 jobs my first day. Timed my mother into taking me to Kmart with a little red wagon. I took the little barrels of tire around. By the time I was 15, I said, I need to go big. I got to start doing parking lots, but can't do parking lots with a little red wagon, so I called my Uncle Billy Byrne, who owned Byrne Dairy. I said, I need one of your old dairy trucks, Uncle Billy. He said, yeah, Terry got a bunch of them out in an old graveyard. Go out and get one. I went out. I was 15 years old with a buddy of mine with some gas and oil spark plugs. Found the truck that had the least rust. They were all grass up to about here. Worked on it for about an hour and a half, and I remember to this day, when I got up in the cab of that truck, it was a big old dairy truck, about half the distance from here to that wall, and when I turned that key, and that engine roared to life, I knew I was an entrepreneur. And that sense of opportunity that I had, I want all children in Virginia to have that same opportunity that Terry McAuliffe had. Since that time, I've started my hand to starting, running, and investing in a wide variety of businesses. Chairman of the bank at the age of 30, I've built thousands of homes, I've been in renewable energy, I've been in a lot of different things. And along the way, I've learned some very important lessons. Risk is inherent in our economy, and innovation isn't easy. But I've also learned how to respond to a changing economy and how to encourage economic growth. Today, Virginia finds herself at some unique crossroads. We did a lot better than many of the other states in the country during the Great Recession during the last 2 years, primarily because we are the #1 recipient of DoD spending. But as we all now know, stimulus is over. There's about $500 billion baked into the Department of Defense cuts. Sequestration is here for the year. And I think most people would say it's likely on September 30 that Congress will vote to take sequestration in for another year. That will have a dramatic impact on the Virginia economy. We are the #1 recipient. We are still going to be the #1 recipient, but the denominator will be smaller. So how do we grow? How do we diversify our economy? How do we build a new energy economy in Virginia? So the next 4 years are even going to be more challenging than we have faced the last 4 years. It matters who serves as government. And it matters that they're focused on growing and diversifying our economy. My wife Dorothy and I moved to Virginia 21 years ago. And while our address hasn't changed, I can clearly tell you our commute to jobs, to school, soccer games, lacrosse, rugby games certainly has. You name it. In Northern Virginia, we spend 67 hours a year stuck in traffic. In Hampton Roads, it's 43 hours per year. That's around $1 billion lost in Northern Virginia just sitting in traffic. About $700 million in tidal water. In energy usage, that translates into 38 gallons per year per person here in Northern Virginia. It effectively is an artificial tax on Virginia businesses and individuals. So I was proud of leaders of both parties who this year passed the first significant investment in transportation in 27 years. I was proud to help encourage the Democrats to support the planning, and I was frankly amazed that my opponent tried to block this important progress at each and every step. This is a critical difference in this race. On the most important issue facing Virginia's competitiveness, Ken Cuccinelli was a leader in the effort to defeat Governor McDonald's signature transportation package. He even backed a last-minute Tea Party alternative that a conservative columnist described as undermining the progress that has been made. It reflects his career of opposing mainstream transportation projects like the Silver Line. Ken Cuccinelli is the only statewide official to oppose it. Virginia's been ranked consistently under Governors Warner and Kane as the best state in America to do business. But in the last few years, we have now dropped to 5th, partly because of our transportation system. Now we have adequate funding, we have to pick the right projects and build the right ones. We should review the laundry list from top to bottom and pull the plug when these projects no longer make sense. I believe that the new projects, #1, should ease congestion, #2, should have an economic development component, and 3, there should be local support and say in what we do on these transportation projects. The bottom line on transportation, we cannot effectively attract businesses if we don't have a modern, efficient transportation system. I also believe firmly that K-12 education is the single most important tool we have to build a stronger Virginia. We need to ensure that we are preparing our students for tomorrow's jobs. I'd start by reforming the standards of learning. We must ensure that a third grade education actually confers a third grade body of knowledge. But the current, once a year, high stakes, multiple choice testing isn't working for students, isn't working for parents, and clearly is not working for our teachers. We've got to get our teachers away from having to teach to tests. If school districts want to break up the SOL into smaller portions, administer it closer to the beginning of the school year, or give the test differently for those children with different learning styles, then we should support that. We must also attract the best and retain the best teachers. Mark Warner's bipartisan tax reform package was the single largest investment in K-12 education in Virginia history. But as soon as Virginia made progress, many of our neighboring states did as well. When you compare average teacher pay to the average wage in Virginia, Virginia ranks 50th out of 50 states. Virginia is one of the wealthiest states in the United States of America. We should never be 50th in any category. A large percentage of our teachers are now nearing retirement. We've got to have the resources to attract the best and brightest teachers to replace the coming wave of retirements. The only way that K-12 education investment is possible if we follow responsible budgeting that has earned Virginia such a strong reputation. As you know, my opponent, Kenny Cuccinelli, has proposed a $1.4 billion per year tax cut. It sounds great, and I'd love to stand up here today and promise you a gigantic tax cut, but it is fiscally irresponsible. And he won't say how we would pay for it. The former Republican chair of the House Appropriations Committee pointed out there is no such thing as a free lunch. First, Virginia is already a very low-tax state. It's one of the reasons that we're known for being a great place to do business. Second, the cost of those tax cuts has to come from somewhere. It could mean cuts to education that would undermine all of our schools. When we have to compete against 200 nations around the world and 49 other states for business, we cannot afford steep cuts in K-12 education. But don't take my word for it. Republicans like Bill Bolling and Democrats like Mark Warner have said his plan would cause an entirely new budget crisis. At the higher ed level, we need a skilled workforce for 21st century jobs. 3 out of every 5 of our higher ed students today attends one of our great 23 community colleges. I'm visiting all 23. I've been to 22 so far. They are on the front lines of our economy to prepare our workers for jobs, retune their skills for new jobs, and attract new employers to the Commonwealth. I know that I will have no higher priority for the next 4 years than to make our community colleges the engines of workforce development in Virginia. Every dollar spent on community colleges workforce training multiplies in a hyper-local way into our economy. On economic development, as I've said, we're number 5 on the best places to do business. But North Carolina, Colorado, and Georgia are now nipping at our heels. We've got to work every single day to keep Virginia globally competitive. We need to constantly review and streamline to have smarter regulations and strengthen our efforts to oversee our current regulations rather than constantly creating new ones. We need to be cutting red tape and solving problems for business. As governor, I will empower the Chief Jobs Creation Officer to be a single point of contact for resolving problems and cutting red tape. And we have a great opportunity in healthcare. And here's another critical difference in this campaign. Accepting the federal funds for expansion of Medicaid will not only ensure that 400,000 Virginians will get access to quality life-saving care, we will also create up to 33,000 new jobs, and we will bring over the next 7 years $21 billion of Virginians' federal tax money back to Virginia. That is why it is supported by so many on a bipartisan basis, including the Virginia Chamber of Commerce. I know that we're going to spend the full Q&A on energy policy specifics, but my approach on energy issues is pretty simple. If we want to lower energy costs for consumers and attract those 21st century energy jobs, Virginia needs to be a leader in cutting-edge technology. On coal, we're already doing a great job at Virginia Tech on the carbon capture and sequestration, which will help protect the 5,100 direct jobs that we have, but also lead to new energy jobs. At Old Dominion University, the research that they're doing on solar technologies holds so much promise for us for jobs down the road. Taking energy technology to the next level requires a governor who values scientific research and supports innovative work in the energy field from all of our great universities, from University of Virginia to George Mason University. To attract those scientists and researchers and 21st century innovators, Virginia has to be a commonwealth that is open to business and welcoming to all. I talk to business leaders from both parties every single day. I constantly hear that politicians focusing on a social ideological agenda is not helpful for business. We cannot be putting walls up around Virginia by attacking women's rights, scientists, or gay Virginians. This is a fundamental difference in this race. I know we need to focus on the economy. How do we grow? How do we diversify? Ken Cuccinelli has shown that he will spend his time in office on a social, divisive, ideological battles, and those battles have defined his career. The Washington report this morning from the Washington Post that was in our newspapers was shocking. It detailed his ties to a radical group that fought against adequate child support because they think it is, quote, punitive, unquote, to men. And groups that, quote, contend that men are frequently victimized by false allegations of domestic abuse, unquote. According to the Washington Post, my opponent even took the unusual step of handling the private case for a leader in these groups while he was sitting Attorney General. Ken Cuccinelli has worked to implement their agenda on trying to restrict women's health care rights. Quote, Cuccinelli also was the lone Senate vote against legislation to increase child support payments by tying them more closely to inflation, unquote. Opposing adequate child support is inexplicable and it's just plain wrong. And quote, Cuccinelli offered a bill that would have made it so parents initiating a no-fault divorce could have that action counted against them when deciding custody issues, unquote. Why would you introduce legislation that could punish people who want to get out of a bad marriage? And quote, 47 state attorney generals sent a letter to Congress urging lawmakers to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. Cuccinelli was one of 3 who did not sign it, unquote. My opponent still won't explain what he dislikes so much about the Violence Against Women Act, but that group he is tied to believe that many women make up claims of domestic abuse. During this campaign, there are many issues where Ken Cuccinelli and I have disagreed, and on some of them, I can at least understand his position, even if I don't agree with it. But the positions today laid out in the Washington Post on child support and the Violence Against Women Act and on family law is just beyond my comprehension. And I believe beyond the comprehension of most Virginians. As governor, my bottom line is simple. We cannot move Virginia forward by holding women back. Women are 50% of the workforce of the United States of America. We need to be encouraging women from all over the globe to come to Virginia to help us build that new energy sector, to become the leader in cybersecurity, bio, and nano life sciences. These types of policies are not just wrong, they're harmful and have serious consequences. Not long after he became Attorney General, Ken Cuccinelli sent a letter to colleges across Virginia trying to get rid of the non-discrimination policies for sexual orientation. Because of that letter, the deal to bring Northrop Grumman's corporate headquarters to Northern Virginia, 300 high-quality jobs, was jeopardized. The governor, Bob McDonnell, had to step in to override Cuccinelli and save that deal. Ken Cuccinelli's social agenda is more than just extreme. It is bad for business. The Republican lieutenant governor said just this week, quote, he is a rigid ideologue who thrives on conflict and confrontation. when Virginia faces headwinds from federal spending cuts and the possibility of a new round of BRAC, Virginia simply cannot afford to have their leaders pursuing their own rigid ideological agenda. As governor, I'm going to spend my time every day focused on growing and diversifying our economy. And I'm going to do that by working on mainstream, bipartisan, pragmatic solutions to transportation, workforce training, energy innovation, and K-12 education. I look forward to your questions today. I thank you for inviting me. This is a group I've spoken to several times. I would hope to earn your support in this campaign. We have a lot of work to do in the next coming years, and I look forward to working with everybody in this room on those projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us again, and we really appreciate the focus that you have made on energy issues. You know, last year, American drivers spent more than $2,800 on average on gasoline, which is the largest share of take-home income in more than 30 years. With gasoline prices still well over $3 a gallon and rising, as well as the oil price shocks that could result from issues in the Middle East, what do you think your administration can do to help stabilize gasoline and diesel costs and help reduce their burdens that people are paying at the pump?
Well, I think there's a couple things we can do. First and foremost, as I explained, as it relates to, we're stuck in traffic so much in Virginia. In Northern Virginia, as I said, it's 67 hours a year. Now the governor will have some transportation funding to ease congestion. So the first and most important thing is they don't have to use as much gas because they're not sitting in traffic as much. In addition, in the Tidewater region, it's the same thing. And where we have huge congestion issues in Northern Virginia, it's very disconcerting what's happening in Hampton Roads today. It's not only about, as it relates to the consumers who are buying the gas, it's about what's going to happen 5, 10, 15 years down the road, and there are going to be jobs for their children. And it's jeopardized today in Hampton Roads because it is just absolute gridlock. In Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach, it's about tourism. It's about our military assets, all the military assets that we have in Virginia, and it's about our port. So this is such a critical issue, and I hope we continue to move towards energy independence, but as governor, spending that transportation money wisely, I think is one of the most important things I can do. I mean, a lot of this, as you know, relates at the federal level, but at the state level, spending that money, easing traffic congestion, helping businesses move around. And I speak for everybody in this audience. We've all run across folks who are stuck in traffic all day. I recently visited D.D. Jones. I think they were started in 1928 with a horse and a wagon down in Hampton Roads. They talk about the problems they have, trucking company moving the goods around. Now, at some point, they're not going to stay stuck in traffic. They're going to move to another state. So, making sure that we can ease congestion, but I'm also a huge proponent of the metro and what we can do to get folks out of cars and into mass transit. I'm a huge supporter. My opponent said he would kill the Silver Line after it was halfway completed. I am all for the Silver Line. The idea that we're opening up our great international airport to have the metro and then going on into Loudoun County will get cars off of roads. It will help on economic development. We have the tide down in Norfolk, and they just voted at Virginia Beach to take the tide all the way to Virginia Beach. We ought to take the tide from our naval base all the way out to Virginia Beach. Because at some point, if you talk to the folks at our naval operations or Oceana, it is gridlock for them. It affects quality of life. Dorothy and I, you say we have 5 children. Going to see our kids play a ball game now is, a couple-hour affair. It shouldn't be. When we moved out to Northern Virginia 21 years ago, Route 7 was great. You could go at any time of the day. You don't get on Route 7 after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You can't. You're stuck. To go a couple miles shouldn't take hours. So the best thing I can do, obviously, is transportation. And I want to commend Governor McDonald. This was not an easy thing for him to do. We went out, now we have some transportation funding, and that's how we're going to grow and diversify our economy and do what we need to do to help consumers at the pumps.
Great. As you mentioned, Governor McDonald has pushed very hard over the last 4 years to brand Virginia as the energy capital of the East Coast through efforts to expand traditional energy development, onshore and offshore, the establishment of a nuclear energy consortium, and push legislation to promote increased use of renewable and alternative energy, as well as energy efficiency. What of these types of programs do you think are necessary for the state over the next 4 years, and would you seek to implement in your tenure?
Well, all of them. But energy efficiency is something that many of our neighboring states have moved faster than we have on energy efficiency. There's so much work that we can do on energy efficiency. First and foremost, before we need more energy, let's see if we can't conserve it, which would be the smartest thing we can do. tremendous opportunities on what we can do. We just put geothermal in our homes, spectacular. But we need to incentivize, obviously, our Virginia homeowners to do the best that they can, obviously, to conserve the energy. Huge opportunities on wind. I've talked about wind, you and I have had discussions on wind for many years. We need to be a leader on wind. Obviously, offshore wind is a tremendous potential for us. I think probably Massachusetts is probably going to be the first in the water. I think but we ought to be right behind it. I know we have some issues. We have to do some, obviously, some good negotiating on this, on the seismic and everything else that's going with that. But let's go ahead and push forward. I'd love to see Virginia as the second in the water. I think it would be spectacular. You and I have discussed it. There's an area out there that we literally could light up 10,000 homes with what we could do with offshore wind. But guess what? Along the way, we could create 10,000 jobs. I have always said, when we talk about renewable energy, energy efficient, all the different things that we need to do, these are the jobs of the 21st century. It's being done all over the world. This is not something new. You look at the jobs that have been created all over the world in renewable space. But if we're going to do offshore wind, let's build the turbines, blades, rotors, poles. Let's do it, manufacture them all here in Virginia. We have the deepest port on the East Coast. We have tremendous opportunity to do it. So for me, it's also important what we do on energy independence, to move ourselves to it, to keep our energy costs low, make it efficient. But we can create a lot of jobs in the energy sector. Other states are doing it. We've got to take the lead on that.
Completely agree. You know, you mentioned in your statement Virginia's universities and schools, including George Mason here today, have helped advance new research on technologies that can dramatically increase, the potential for Virginia's energy future. How do you plan to work with the universities as well as private institutions to push solutions for the energy challenges?
And that's a great question, something I've talked about a lot, and many of our colleges and universities in all different forms are working on renewable energy projects. I recently toured ODU and the great work that they're doing at ODU on wave technology. There's just so many great things that are going on. What we have to do a better job of here in Virginia is we have such great colleges and universities. We've got to take that research that they're doing, and we have to commercialize it. We have to take it out to market. And we, at the state level, need to do public-private partnerships to work together to commercialize the great research that we have going on. It exists, but we have to help move it to the next level. We need to bring venture capitalists in to help us do that. I just met with a group Uber here, 100 incubators who are here in Northern Virginia. Spectacular work they're doing. But they made it clear, they said, Terry, unless we get some help here with some venture capitalists coming in, guess what? We may have to go out to Silicon Valley because that's where the money is. We all want to be together. We got to stop that. We need to be the capital here. I view us as being the capital of the new energy sector, the new energy economy. But we've got to do it. It's public-private. It's all of us working together. You cannot do it alone. And our colleges and universities will take the lead on what we need to do. On energy, I was at George Mason's campus the other day, and they have two great new scientists that they have from NIH. They're doing nanoscience technology. Spectacular what they're doing. They've already begun to commercialize what they're doing. Those are the jobs of the future. Energy, bio, nano, all of these new sectors are what we have to do. And the key point I try to make, we are going to face some headwinds with the cuts that we have seen coming. Sequestration, most likely most people say that we're going to see sequestration for another year. And I think for many companies, this year's sequestration, I think they sort of cut the low-hanging fruit. We have sequestration for another year. We're going to have to begin to cut limbs off of trees. It's going to be a dramatic impact because, as I say, we're the #1 recipient of DOD. We're still going to be one, but billions of dollars are going to be cut out of that budget. How do we replace those military assets and create private sector jobs? Energy can lead the way to do that. And I've talked renewable energy for a long time in different sectors and waste and other things that we need to do. We've got all the tools here. We got all the tools in the toolbox, but let's start really using that toolbox to really build what we need to do, that framework to make us #1 globally.
Great. One last question. So many of the federal positions and programs and departments and agencies have a direct impact on energy policy here in Virginia. And there are federal laws and regulations that seem to trump state regulations and state laws on many things. As an ambassador of the state to the federal government, what role do you see in the governor's office in being able to push the federal government to be more collaborative and work with the state on developing the state's energy priorities?
Great question. And two ways to look at it. I look at both ways. #1, if the federal government is proposing policies, and we don't know, some of the new policies have not come out, they've announced, but we don't actually know what the proposals are. But if there are proposals and policies that are coming out that will adversely affect one single Virginia job, you need to go to Washington and you need to do everything you can to stop it. We need to make sure we protect every job that we have in Virginia today. And as governor, I would access all the different areas up there to make sure that nothing is being done that could adversely impact one Virginia job. Secondly, it is utilizing doing what we need to do to help us go to the next level. There are billions of dollars that have been allocated at the federal level to help in the energy space to take and come up with these new technologies. I would be a great ambassador up there arguing, doing what we need to do to make sure that, you know, as governor, I don't want Virginia to get its fair share. I'd like us to get more than our fair share. That's what you want in your governor, out there advocating. But, you know, as I've told folks, listen, this is an important area for us. I have said this for so many years. Energy, and those new energy sector jobs are what are going to drive the economy. And that state that is creating those new jobs is going to lead the way on a global basis. We have such assets in Virginia to make us the global leader on this. We've got to get everybody working together in a bipartisan way. And I think that's why, as you've all read in the newspapers, that so many Republican business leaders and political leaders, in fact, 2 former state senators yesterday, have endorsed my candidacy. I will work with anybody 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to help us grow and diversify our economy. But we're going to do it through energy, and I look forward to working with everybody in this room to make Virginia globally #1 on those new energy sector jobs. I'm excited about it, and I look forward to working with you as governor. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And I understand that Terry has agreed to take a few questions from the press, so we'll be out this side door back here, down through here. Good, thank you, Adam.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you. And we'll be setting up our second panel in just about 5 minutes.
Working hard. You too. Keep get you in trouble, people. I'm glad somebody young. Look at the average age here. All right. Take care. Absolutely. Listen, you got your if I had my rate, it would be glasses. No. The next one will be better. I wouldn't mind a hurricane. That's all I got to say. That's
Yeah, he's going to put
Get up and walk out and you know, I'm just saying, this is not I still haven't thought about I work with Michael at Energy. Michael knows at Energy. Michael moderating. Consumer asking. So I said, well, Michael, I don't know who your job Oh, sorry, we're in the chair, Steve.
Yeah, so
Me too. I was going to ask that. I'm not surprised. Well, that's why I'm very
Probably fun.
Oh, car company. Yeah, good job. His energy saving company. I started this little thing called Billions of
We can go ahead and have folks take their seats and we can get started with our second panel.
Ceremonies yesterday, but they weren't invited until last night.
I'd like to take just a second to introduce Brett Bassey, who's the President and CEO for Virginia Manufacturers Association. Brett serves as the sixth President and CEO of the association, which represents the Commonwealth's 6,000 manufacturers, which employ over 220,000 individuals, contribute over $34 billion to the gross state product, and account for over 80% of the state's exports to the global economy. In addition to his work with VNA, Brett has been a tireless champion on energy issues. He currently serves on our board, and Consumer Energy Alliance has been a tremendous ally for us over the past several years. With that, Brett, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the CEA and also for you all coming out today on this bright and sunny day to hear about energy. This morning we are very fortunate to have a really outstanding panel talking about particularly empowering Virginia under access to affordable, reliable electricity, and that's a very purposeful discussion. To my right, David Hudgens with Old Dominion Electric Cooperative. David is the Director of Member and External Relations. They are headquartered in Glen Allen, Virginia. They're a generation and transmission cooperative that supplies electricity to 12 member distribution cooperatives that serve over 500,000 consumers in Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. To his right, Bruce Burkett with Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Coalition. Bruce is an attorney with 23 years of experience in utility and energy regulation. He's also responsible for the coalition's efforts to promote growth and development in renewable energy in the 9 jurisdictions within the PJM footprint, including Virginia. And the PJM is the Regional Distribution Authority for the Mid-Atlantic. And last but certainly not least, we have Marshall Cohen with Babcock & Wilcox. Those of you who are Virginians, you know him as B&W in Lynchburg. Marshall is the Vice President of Government Affairs and Communications for the company, where he's responsible for planning and implementing their strategic government affairs, communications, and public relations efforts. He works at the company across all their various divisions on image and brand and articulating their position on issues involving the commercial nuclear industry, fossil power industry, environmental regulations, national defense, and government services. So, that is your panel today. We have prepared some questions. Just so you know the order, we have 5 questions we're going to go through. Each one of the candidates are candidates. No, see what I mean? One presentation, I'm in candidate mode. We have 5 questions. The first one, each of them is going to answer, and then I have an individual question for each of them, and then they're going to end by answering the same question. So we hope that'll be a good format for everybody. On the first, I'd like each of you to address, and we'll start with David. If you were advising the next governor of Virginia on how best to ensure that electricity is both affordable and reliable, what would you tell him?
Great question, and we struggle with that every day at Old Dominion of how we get the right mix of energy to our consumers, to our member owners. And with that exception, it really is all the above approach. We have coal, we have nuclear, we have gas, we have wind. And so we take all of those sources of energy to meet the growing demand. And right now we're in a low growth mode of about 1.5% in Virginia. Before the Great Recession, we were growing at 4% per year. So truly we're talking about just having the capacity to provide the growth that's going to occur as the economy continues to recover. So, I think how we're going to meet that is through all the above approach.
Bruce, affordable and reliable.
Yes. Is this mic on? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Renewable energy actually is very reliable. We are part of a large grid, the PJM grid, which controls transmission throughout a number of jurisdictions, actually 13. And they have a large balancing system, which basically means that they have a lot of very flexible generating facilities that can ramp up, ramp down. So reliability is really not an issue at all with renewable energy, especially in a system like PJM. They can certainly accommodate the levels that we have so far at in PJM. In fact, they can accommodate dramatically more that's out there. From a cost perspective, wind in particular has there are a number of studies out there now that show that wind, and this is a benefit to consumers, but wind actually has a price suppression effect in these types of markets. So when wind is growing in the region, it's actually ultimately reducing the price of energy overall to customers. It basically offsets some of the more expensive generation out there. You have to remember that wind's fuel is basically wind, and it's free. So when they bid into the market, they bid in very low, and so they displace some more expensive generation out there. So really, there's a number of reasons why costs are going to be very reasonable if you add a lot more renewable energy into the system. One of the concerns we have in Virginia is that we have actually no wind generation, even though most of the states in the region have plants installed in their state and providing benefits to their citizens. So my organization, which is primarily made up of developers, wind developers, large ones, turbine manufacturers like GE, who has a plant in Virginia, are very interested in coming into Virginia, developing plants. Some are under development stages at this point, but because of the regulatory climate, it's difficult to get plant in the ground until some of that changes. But we certainly see renewable energy as a economic and also a very reliable alternative out there. And we're not saying get rid of everything else. We understand that it's an all of the above type of philosophy. So we definitely think that's the right approach for the state.
Thanks, Bruce. Marshall?
Thank you. Good morning. And I just want to add my appreciation to CEA, which is an organization I think does a great job, and for George Mason. And a special note just of having been around politics for a long time, to be able to get both candidates in this very tough race to come here and focus a little bit on these issues is a great coup, and I think glad to be part of it. I was supposed to talk about nuclear a little bit, so I'm happy to do that. In the United States, 19% of the electricity that we all use comes from nuclear. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, it's 38%. The 4 nuclear reactors at North Anna and Surrey produce that much electricity, more than any other source within the Commonwealth. So it has to be, every effort has to be made to keep it affordable and reliable. And I think the experience of the nuclear industry with those reactors especially is that is indeed the case. Nuclear, tends to be get caught up in what I refer to as sort of ideological battles. There's people who hate nuclear, there's people who support it. But I think in the Commonwealth, the approach that is being taken is not ideological, it's very practical. And the evidence for that, and Michael made reference to it earlier when talking to Terry McAuliffe, was that this year Governor McDonnell introduced and the legislature enacted, with a lot of support from outside the legislature, the Virginia Nuclear Energy Consortium. And this is a terrific opportunity to bring together in this organization the educational community. All the universities will be participating, the private sector will be participating, the state energy officials will be participating, and it's a way to look at where nuclear is in the Commonwealth and the percentage and the strong position it has, but then how you go forward and how you meet the demands going on, what that has to do with clean air, and of course it is a clean air type of technology, and how you keep it reliable and affordable. My company is involved, and we think we're the world's leader in developing what's known as small modular reactors. These are nuclear reactors of usually under 200 megawatts. And we're developing a lot of that actually at our facilities in Lynchburg. And we're very excited about it. We've got support to do it from the United States Department of Energy. We're working with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and we think, but they're 5 to 10 years away because it just takes a while to develop this stuff. But we also understand it's expensive. There's a large capital investment in bringing on nuclear. But once you turn the switch on, the fuel costs and the operating capabilities keep that power at a low cost, and it runs 24/7 is what the industry calls baseload. So we are very conscious of the need to make sure that this new technology of reactors, the small reactors, can indeed meet the standard of affordability and reliability, and of course, safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Marshall. Moving on to the regulatory side of this issue from the energy side, the U.S. EPA has pushed aggressively over the last few years regulations targeting coal-fired power plants. And President Obama recently announced a new climate action plan and directed the EPA to propose new federal regulations on both new and existing power plants. So the question is, what does all of this mean for utilities' ability to ensure reliability in the electric utility market supply, and what impact might that have on consumers' electricity bills? David?
God, I could do a seminar on it. 2 minutes or less. The EPA's aggressiveness in going after coal, and it truly is a war on coal. It starts in the mines, it starts in then in transportation, then the actual plants to burning is unprecedented in regulatory history. So it is something you got to deal with. The carbon rule that's going to come out, ag laws, in essence, all future coal plants, and now we're waiting for the other shoe to drop on the existing plants. The problem with utilities is that literally we have hundreds of billions of dollars invested in these plants. And does that become a restrained investment? If it does, the utilities don't take the hit. It's you and your families and your children. At the end of the day, it gets rolled into the rate base, and you're going to pay for it one way or the other. If that plane's running or not running, consumers are going to pay for it. So it's really paramount to understand that these regulatory decisions made by the EPA, at the end of the line is the consumer, or in co-op's case, member owners. So one of the things that we battle with the EPA all the time, I'm going to be up here in Washington next week, is trying to sensitize the decision makers that these decisions, especially if you're a retired person and you're on a fixed income, and now you're going to make energy truly, if these programs are put into place and then enforced, you're going to see a doubling or tripling of your consumer electricity bill, which for us is, in this room, I think can afford that. We're going to grumble about it. But if you're that retired person on a fixed income, it's going to be major decisions because you're struggling with medical, you're struggling with drugs, food has gone out of the roof, and now your electricity bill. We're 97% residential, and we don't have retained earnings. It drops right to our bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Another question related to that, probably for anybody that wants to comment. We talked about costs. We talked about regulation. Oftentimes, for folks who aren't in this market, they don't understand oftentimes that regulations, you won't see the effect at the rate base for several years. When you look at the construction costs for electricity related to nuclear, when you look at EPA regulations, do you all have any ideas in particular about how you could better make the public aware upfront when we're making decisions that we think are good decisions about regulating electricity, but we really don't know the end cost? There's no way to do that. I'm familiar with Virginia. We actually have no way of knowing the cost of decisions before they're already made on how we regulate our electric utilities. So that's a little blindness in the public policy process. You all have any ideas about that?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. I used to work at a regulatory commission, state regulatory commission, and I personally think that transparency, providing as much information to the consumer as possible out there to make them understand what the situation is, why the state is taking a certain action, and especially as a result of basically policies that are out of their control that the federal government is driving. So, as much as possible, I mean, I don't think the best result is to blast the federal government all the time. I think what it is provide as much information why you're doing this, and also seek alternatives as best as you can to try to lessen the load on consumers. Sometimes delaying the impacts of some of these costs, pushing them out for a number of years, might be a way to handle those situations.
Yeah, first I want to make a comment on the regulatory question, if I might. Just what's important to utilities and to industry is certainty in these things. I mean, that's the concept that is really, really important, because you're not going to make, I mean, we're a publicly traded company with shareholders and the board of directors. We have to look at possible investments and look at those kinds of issues. And if there's uncertainty, people are going to shy away. So to the extent that the regulatory process can build in certainty, and with EPA, that's very difficult. And I think you're going to see that with these new proposals that come out on the clean air side of things, because there's going to be a million comments, and they're going to go back in, and there's probably going to be litigation and so forth, so it's going to drag out. With respect to the cost issue, there are policies that are in place in some states that help large construction projects. And on the utility side, it's called construction work in progress. But what it means is that ratepayers are asked to pay a little bit more up front to help reduce the amount of interest being paid on the construction of these facilities. And if you can reduce the amount of interest being paid, and sometimes it's interest on interest, longer term you're going to reduce the cost necessary to support that, the cost to consumers. But the problem is that becomes the notion of asking ratepayers up front to pay more when the facility has not been built or is not completed, and there's no guarantee how it's going to work. That is a complex and difficult issue. So you get into political fights and other kinds of things, and oftentimes then you're not able, the state will not adopt that kind of policy, and then the utility will back away, or whoever's going to develop this will back away from the construction. So, I mean, and there are ways to put caveats on those policies in terms of requirements of prudency and maybe requirements of, paying something back if you don't turn it on. But it's not a simple process. And I agree with the comment about, if I were doing that, I'd sure as heck be out there talking to everybody and having, making sure the public understands as best possible. And the organizations that just sort of generally come out and opposing that, try and work with them and resolve, find the middle ground so these kinds of projects can move ahead.
My answer is kind of more straightforward. I think at the end of the day, there should be Congress should pass a law that would cost benefit. Every one of these environmental rules, the new MATS rule by EPA's on emissions, is the most expensive rule ever passed in the federal government's history. It should be a cost benefit so that we all as citizens can say, well, here's this mega cost. What is the actual benefit? How do we as Americans benefit from that rule? So that we can make that value judgment, if you will. Are we willing to shoulder that cost? And I think that's what's missing in the equation, is how to do the cost benefit.
Thank you. So here's some cost benefits and transparency issues, and certainly we've got those things to look forward to in the near term, I think, as well. We have a few minutes left and some closing thoughts that I'd like each of you to address. In particular, we talked about the federal and the state and how they mix between, and of course the candidate this morning spoke about that. We'll hear the candidate after we're here as well. So what role do you see states like Virginia needing to play in helping to shape federal energy policy? We talk about Washington almost as if it is an entity in and of itself and in a land far away. But what can the state do to help shape that federal policy? Marshall.
Sure. I think states can do an awful lot. I mean, first of all, you start with the premise that the federal government is not going to have an energy policy, however you define an energy policy. It's just not going to. States, I'm a real devotee of what states can do. They really are laboratories of democracy. They really can do things I think, again, go back to the Virginia Nuclear Energy Consortium. This is just a terrific idea. And, I've been going around talking to governors' associations and legislators' associations and say, you ought to look at what Virginia did this year, because it's a great model to look at one major energy source and figure out policy-wise how you're going to go forward and bringing in all the right players. States need to lead Washington. States need to come to Washington and show them what can be done. And all of a sudden, if you get a few states acting in the same direction, you will find Washington beginning to look at that and saying, maybe we need to do that in that way. So I'm a complete advocate, and I hope that whoever is elected governor will kind of keep that going. But also do it back to my original statement, do it in a pragmatic way, a way that brings folks together and can work on the issues and so forth, and avoid the ideological stuff that goes on up here that doesn't solve any problems, just makes headlines. But the fact of the matter is, we need to address these issues in the right way. States can do it.
Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, I agree with Marshall on the fact that the states actually have to lead in this environment. For instance, I'm obviously speaking on behalf of the renewable energy industry here, certainly my members. So one of the things that states have been doing, in Virginia to some extent, for renewables is setting up state renewable portfolio standards. They have their own policies, but we now have 29 states that are doing that. And so what has become maybe a state, very small state-specific initiative is now turned into a majority of the states. A lot of the big states are doing this. I think that's something that Virginia could certainly do in the area of renewable energy, where they could make their voluntary standard a mandatory standard like the other 29 states. So I do think that the states need to lead in this way, and maybe at some point, if enough of the states move in that direction, then the federal government will follow in some way. I'm also a believer of, if the types of policies that are coming out of Washington are onerous on the states should be working together to try to at least work out some kind of plan to have reasonable implementation of some of these policies. So, there's a number of ways to go about it, but I totally agree with Marshall. The states have to, whether it's the nuclear industry or the renewables industry or other industries, the states need to determine what their policy is and move forward and work with other states to get this done.
David, last word.
Last word, just because of the gridlock that's occurring in Washington, I think the states are going to take the lead to drive the policy. Electricity is important and critical to every one of our lives. National defense to health care, none of it happens without affordable electricity. So how do we get our states engaged in the fact that we have to provide, for the growth? I mean, when people hook up to our lines, they don't want to hear that we don't have enough capacity. They want to hook up to the lines. Just look at the growth in electronics and things you plug into the wall in our individual homes. I mean, all of that means that we've got to provide that reliable electricity, and I think the states are going to take the lead on pushing the federal government to recognize that this, you can get the policy wrong. I mean, seriously, you can get the energy policy wrong, and a coal plant takes 7-8 years to put online, a nuclear plant 10 years.
5 to 10 depends. We'll know after the Georgia plants come on in a couple of years.
Right. So, I mean, the ship doesn't turn around when you say, oh, man, we just didn't work out the way we wanted to. And you've got a plan, I call it utility time for lack of anybody else, Brett. It's 10 to 15 years out. So, states have got to recognize, leaving them to take care of their people. We've got 8 million people in Virginia who wants reliable and affordable electricity. And I think states have got a huge role in that in driving Washington.
David, thank you. Folks, thank you very much for listening to this panel. We hope you got something out of it. We have transparency, affordability, all of the above policy, and certainly I think the 10th Amendment does mean something to this panel, so very good. David Hart with GMU is going to take us to our next part of our program.
Thank you, Brett, for a terrific panel. Really appreciate it. So it's my privilege to introduce Ken Cuccinelli, current Attorney General and Republican candidate for Governor of the Commonwealth. George Mason University. Mr. Cuccinelli was sworn in as Attorney General in January 2010. Prior to assuming that office, he was a leading conservative member of the Virginia Senate from 2002 until 2010. His experience as a small business owner and as an attorney prepared him for his role in General Assembly, where he served on the Courts of Justice Committee, Transportation Committee, Local Government Committee, Rehabilitation and Social Services Committee, and the Agriculture, Conservation, and Natural Resources Committee. As a state senator, Mr. Cuccinelli led the fight to defend constitutional rights, stop tax increases, protect life and families, and keep Virginia a low-regulation and pro-free market state. Prior to assuming his current office, Mr. Cuccinelli was a small business owner and partner in the law firm of Cuccinelli & Day in Fairfax. His work ranged across a number of legal topics, including litigation, licensing, financing, employment, advertising, branding, corporate formation, business transaction and contracts for both domestic and international clients, and particularly for small and mid-sized businesses. Mr. Cuccinelli also had experience in public interest, constitutional law, and property rights cases. And we're very pleased to welcome you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you all. I'm glad to be here to actually talk about what this forum is about, energy. Because I actually have an energy policy, and I'm happy that we get to talk about that. I want to thank the Consumer Energy Alliance for hosting us today, and I also want to thank Terry for participating. It's good to be back in my alma mater. I'm not just a single Pat, I'm a double. Law degree and a master's here. Of course, facilities like this weren't here when I was here, but I went to law school in the department store. Distinction being the one law school, of course, with an escalator. So you take contracts in the sports department and so forth. But I'm glad we can be here to talk about how energy, and in particular how we continue to make Virginia the capital of energy on the East Coast, if we can accomplish that. By way of introduction, I'm the only candidate in this race who has got a lifetime of putting Virginians first. My entire adult lifetime, whether it's preventing sexual assault, helping fight homelessness right here in Arlington at the shelter down by the courthouse, or whether it's been a particular passion for me, and that's helping people suffering from mental illness, which I've worked to do for over 15 years. That's been a big deal to me, and I carried it into the Senate with me. I've worked on that as Attorney General, and I certainly would carry that into the governor's office if I'm fortunate enough to win in November. I've also served in state government more than 10 years. I know how state government works. I'm the only candidate in this race who won't need on-the-job training if I get elected governor on November 5th. Now, my Italian grandfather, Cuccinelli, you can tell there's some Italian in there. My Italian grandfather probably didn't even have a 6th grade education. He was one of the hardest working people I've ever known. He worked in a scrapyard, he worked as a welder. Later in life, he's a school maintenance man. Probably the toughest job he ever had was as a bare-knuckle boxer during the Depression, and if he won the fight, he'd get a watch and pawn it to raise a little money, and if he lost, well, he lost. And he was proud to work to support his family, and that respect for the dignity of work has been passed along in my family, but it isn't unique to us. Ordinary Virginians, other ordinary Virginians all across the Commonwealth want nothing more than to share in the dignity of work. That's something that is a focus for me as a potentially the next governor here of Virginia. It's why I'll support energy policies that help grow jobs for the middle class, help the poor rise up, and leave families and businesses with a little more of their own hard-earned money to reinvest in growing jobs right here in Virginia. Energy policy is economic policy, and it's important to remember that connection all the time. I've proposed, as I said, a comprehensive energy policy that will protect the thousands of workers who depend on coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear, and establish Virginia as a leader in the development of high-tech jobs. I'll continue to support policies that ensure that energy prices, especially electricity, don't grow needlessly and hurt both job growth and job retention, both of which are important to us. I continue to fight to protect coal workers and the families who depend on Virginia's coal plants from the destruction of federal overregulation, which I've done as Attorney General, and I'm the only candidate who would reliably do that as governor. I'll fight for Virginia's right to responsibly develop our energy resources, including offshore energy resources, and I'll encourage the free market development of alternative sources of energy, including more nuclear power, solar, wind, geothermal, and other renewable sources. I'll prevent our government from picking winners and losers in the energy markets, something we don't have a great track record of across America. I'll fight burdensome federal regulations that seek to put coal, oil, and natural gas out of business. And I'll continue to reform or eliminate failed energy programs that line the pockets of lobbyists and corporate cronies without delivering the jobs that were promised. I'll certainly continue to protect Virginians from costly energy taxes as best I can that destroy jobs, rob them of their hard-earned money, and make it harder for us to develop our own natural energy resources. Reasonably priced energy is perhaps the strongest economic development driver in the Commonwealth and in the country. If you don't believe me, ask the people of North Dakota, who have 3% unemployment and are paying people $15 an hour to work at McDonald's. That's quite a rate for burger flipping. Government should do all it can to reduce energy costs to consumers and businesses, because it has such enormous consequences for not only the economy, but the opportunities of families. The federal government knows there's oil and gas on our outer continental shelf. We know there's oil and gas on our outer continental shelf. Industry knows there is oil and gas on our outer continental shelf. The industry is ready to go. We have an awful lot of the infrastructure in Southeast Virginia that can support the efforts to go offshore for exploration and ultimately for drilling, but the federal government stands in the way. We're fortunate in Virginia to have strong bipartisan support in Congress from our 2 U.S. senators and most of our representatives for offshore exploration, which is the first step, of course, in development of those resources. That stands in stark contrast to Terry McAuliffe, who spent years fighting for energy policies that hurt the poor and middle class. However, those are policies that Terry planned to profit on through his company, Green Tech. They said as much. Now, before I talk more about energy, my opponent, without apparently a positive agenda of much substance, has made a campaign about attacking me on a variety of issues. I'm sure you heard some of that today. On television, they take it up as well. There's a big difference between Terry and me on most issues. There is a clear contrast in this race in November, and particularly with respect to ethics, which he's been attacking me on in television in particular. You know, when mistakes were reported on my financial disclosures, it was because I reported them. It was because I went back and discovered them. And what did I do with them? I held a news conference to share that with everyone in Virginia. I wasn't proud of making those mistakes, but I think it was important to own up to it to the people of Virginia. And I voluntarily handed that situation over to a Democratic prosecutor who cleared me. Now, Governor McDonald's troubles have certainly upset Virginia's governance. Are Virginians prepared to vote for someone like Terry, who's still involved in a federal investigation on Election Day? Will they vote for someone who may enter office with a federal investigation hanging over his head? That would be a first. Terry's company is under not one, but 2 federal investigations for actions taken while he was chairman. Terry continues to refuse to honestly answer questions, and so while we'd likely only learn the truth about what's really going on in these rather dubious dealings after Election Day, I don't think that's a comfortable position for Virginians. And this cloud isn't new to Terry. There's a guy who rented out the White House bedroom for political donations, proudly bragged about selling seats on Air Force One for political donations, He was an unindicted co-conspirator in a union election money laundering case in the 90s, and he gave over $1 million gift loan to the then President of the United States, Bill Clinton, so they could buy a house in New York and his wife could run for the U.S. Senate. And as they say, the rest is now history on that one. His own party rejected him 4 years ago for a number of reasons, but in particular because he couldn't tell the truth about a host of issues, including the number of jobs he created. Remember, he claimed to have created more jobs than Bill Gates. Democratic primary voters rejected him in 2009, and now he's trying to recreate himself to sound like a centrist, claiming to be a convert on coal and offshore drilling. But don't be fooled. Look at who one of his largest contributors is. A left-wing, radical California environmentalist whose agenda would kill jobs, not create them. And remember what Terry says about his supporters. Quote, "You help me, I help you. That's politics," unquote. Well, that's not my politics. I'm about good policy. Terry's probably been associated with more job destruction than creation over the years. And as he told his fellow Democrats 4 years ago about his investments, quote, "If you don't like it, move to China," unquote. At least on the issue of taking business to China, he's practiced what he preached. Now, we can protect the environment and we can grow the economy. These are not exclusive goals, one from the other. Terry wants you to believe that he's suddenly for offshore drilling, but you can't trust him on that. He's never been for offshore drilling for oil before. Why would he be now? And when push comes to shove, is he really going to go to the mat to fight for this opportunity? Terry is of Washington. He isn't going to fight Washington. I already have. I have a track record that you can trust on this issue. We can reduce our dependence on foreign oil and spark massive job growth right here in our own Commonwealth with environmentally safe drilling off our own coast. We can keep American wealth at home with a common sense energy policy. And as we see more turmoil in the Middle East with Syria and what that's doing to oil prices, that point is just driven home again. In fact, Terry McAuliffe has been a consistent enemy of the Virginia coal industry and the tens of thousands of families it supports. And it's easy to forget in Northern Virginia. It's easy to forget. In Virginia, the war on coal is a war on our poor. That's who suffers in Virginia from the war on coal. That's who suffers. Drive with me down through Southwest Virginia, and you will see what I mean. You can see it. You can see it. In the Democratic primary debate in 2009, he declared that as governor he wanted to, quote, "move past coal," and to work to make sure Virginia never built another coal plant. So here we are with a candidate for governor of Virginia who has supported eliminating an industry that's vital to our state, and particularly vital to one of the poorest parts of our state. Now, for those of you like me from Northern Virginia, that would be like Terry here in Northern Virginia outlawing federal government contractors in Virginia. Just think about what that would do to our economy in Northern Virginia. That gives you a kind of picture of the scope of what the policies he supported are doing, slowly, but doing to Southwest Virginia. What Terry doesn't realize, I hope he doesn't realize, is that the war on coal that he supported is a war on Virginia's poor. Thousands of workers are employed in Virginia's coal mines, and tens of thousands more are employed in jobs that depend heavily on the coal industry. One Virginia Tech study found that for every job in Virginia coal mines, it supports 3 others outside. And it's not just Southwest Virginia. Southside Virginia depends on coal-fired electricity, and 40% of all U.S. coal exports go through the Port of Virginia. That port is probably the single largest economic development driver in all of Virginia. We've had enough of the false promises of Terry McAuliffe his billionaire radical friend, the environmental lobby, and the EPA bureaucrats who assure us of the hypothetical green jobs that they will create by destroying real jobs. Hypothetical jobs don't pay real bills. He's all talk. He's all talk. Just ask some of those unemployed green tech workers. Doesn't appear to have worked out well for them. And unfortunately, we'll likely never find out how much my opponent made on the deal, as he continues to refuse to release his tax returns for public review, which I've done for 8 years' worth, even though he was calling on Mitt Romney to do it last year. Even now, Terry McAuliffe supports a mandatory renewable portfolio standard, which would force our utility companies to switch from coal and natural gas to wind, solar, and geothermal. This would eliminate thousands of jobs and significantly increase utility bills. That's a job killer. My focus is on creating jobs, and I've never had a business owner come up and say to me, you know, I could create more jobs if you just raised my electric bill. Never had it. Virginia's a big state, and I've been crossing it for a lot of years. And I've never had a business owner tell me that. In fact, as I've traveled the Commonwealth, not a single person has come up to me and said they think that skyrocketing costs associated with eliminating coal makes good economic sense and would create jobs. That's what my opponent has supported. Maybe because it'll make money for him, as Green Tech said. In 2009, Kansas made their voluntary renewable portfolio standard mandatory, and the Kansas Policy Institute estimates that that law will eliminate 12,000 jobs during this decade and increase electricity prices by approximately 45%, costing the average family more than $650 per year in higher electricity bills, to say nothing of what it does to the potential for job creation. Studies of Washington and Oregon's renewable portfolio laws have shown similar results, thousands of lost jobs and higher electricity prices. If Terry thinks that's an example of what he calls periodically fewer and smarter regulations, I don't think Virginia can afford him as governor. I'm 100% in favor of the development of solar, wind, geothermal, and other renewable energy sources. We've got that happening in Virginia in some positive ways. But Terry's green tech failure and Solindra's failure are stark reminders that government doesn't pick winners. It picks losers at the taxpayer's expense, your expense. Exactly what my opponent will do as governor. We can't abandon coal, oil, nuclear, natural gas while the private sector works to make the transition to other energy sources and while our universities participate in finding those pathways. And while I have a lifetime of putting Virginians first, Terry has always put himself first. In his most recent business, he stepped over Martinsville and picked the liberal utopia of Mississippi and the People's Republic of China over Virginia. As I said in our only debate, he should run for governor of Mississippi. I wish we'd had more debates, but he refuses that too. Terry's the only candidate in this race who has chased business out of Virginia. He's the only candidate in this race who has chased business out of Virginia. I've helped business thrive in Virginia, and my support for an all-of-the-above energy strategy will continue that track record. Terry McAuliffe's company, Green Tech, is currently under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for actions it took while he was chairman, including making illegal guarantees to investors. We've also read in the Washington Post of multiple Green Tech employees who say they were instructed to fake out investors by pretending to build cars when the investors came into the Green Tech facility. Green Tech's also embroiled in an investigation by the Department of Homeland Security regarding special treatment in a scheme to sell visas to wealthy Chinese investors, at least one of which was connected to a company with close ties to Chinese intelligence services. And that wasn't news at the time. It was already known. Nearly 24 of the people Terry sought visas for were either national security risks or were fraud risks. Even our very reserved Congressman Frank Wolf has weighed in to express his deep concern about Terry's connection to the Chinese. Lest I remind all of you, these are some of the very same people engaged in espionage against our country, and if this stuff wasn't true, you just couldn't make it up. Recently, Green Tech's president said that people like Terry are dangerous to business. Maybe that's why it was published in the Washington Post this past weekend that lawyers have advised Terry and Green Tech officials not to communicate with each other. Folks, whether you agree with me or not, whether it's easy or hard, whether it's popular or unpopular, I will always tell you the truth as best I possibly can. My entire career in public service bears that out. It is one of the starkest contrasts in this race. And when we talk about energy, your ability to believe what the candidate in front of you is saying to you is critically important. Not that it isn't on other issues, but this is one of the areas where that is the biggest difference and can have the most impact. When Terry thought Green Tech would be successful, he bragged about it and, according to company officials, pulled production figures out of thin air to boost his political prospects. And today he writes op-eds saying he was not responsible for the actions undertaken by the company while he was its chairman. Chairman! And this is a man who wants to be the Commonwealth of Virginia's next chief executive officer, chairman of our government. Virginia needs a governor who will be straight with you, not just tell you what he thinks you want to hear. And we need a governor who will show up on day one fighting for Virginia's middle class, not the well-connected and the special interests. You know what you'll get with me. Hardworking, focused on reducing regulations, a small business-friendly Republican who doesn't believe that Obamacare is a job creator, regulation like that is a job killer. Someone with a track record of fighting the government overreaches in Washington with some degree of success and doing it on a bipartisan basis. You may not always agree with me, but you'll always know where I stand. Regulations are hurting Virginia's businesses. Any plan to grow the economy and create jobs must include freeing our employers from the burden of growing regulation, energy over-regulation. One independent study found that eliminating just 5% of the federal regulatory budget would add over 1 million jobs to our economy. That's pretty incredible. That's more than the last full year's data that I recall, and most of those were part-time jobs. On average, eliminating the job of a single federal regulator creates about 100 private sector jobs and grows the economy by more than $6 million. While the numbers aren't as large or the same, the principle is the same at the state level, and the governor sits atop the state's regulatory structure. Sometimes that may mean we have to stand up to Washington, and the candidate from Washington sure isn't going to do that. But I already have. I've done it successfully on a bipartisan basis when Washington has threatened opportunity for Virginia's middle class, and even when they've trampled our Constitution. And that's a course I'll keep us on as your next governor. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
So Ken, I want to start with electricity. You know, Virginia currently gets 95% of its electricity from coal, natural gas, and nuclear energy. And while we have, on one hand, federal regulations pending or soon to be introduced that are targeting coal-fired power generation and are expected to see, to some degree, coal-fired power generation getting hurt. At the same time, Virginia's population is projected to grow 20 to 30% by 2030, and the electricity use in the state is projected to have significant increases as well. As governor, how do you help expand electricity production to help fill that gap?
Well, it's important for us to remember that no single source is going to fill the gap that you're asking about. We have to defend our ability to utilize coal, to go offshore for oil and natural gas, to try and expand potentially our nuclear potential, and we have 4 reactors in Virginia now, and to grow the new and renewable energy sector, while also advancing energy conserving technologies. That's a big deal. A simple example is if you just think one of the data centers we have up here in Northern Virginia, average size data center will use about 40 megawatts of electricity a year. And if they increase their efficiency by just 10%, you knock that down substantially. You drop that from 40 to 36 megawatts a year just with the servers. So those kinds of opportunities exist as well. But you mentioned coal, and coal is critical to Virginia's energy security. Provides over 20,000 jobs in Virginia, contributes over $2 billion to our economy. And as I mentioned in my opening, in 2009, Terry McAuliffe said he didn't want to see another coal plant built in Virginia. Wanted to move past coal. It's straight out of the federal administration's playbook, President Obama's playbook, to wage a war on coal, which is what one of his administrative supporters called it this summer when he renewed that with his speech in June. I don't think Terry McAuliffe is going to rest until coal plants are shut. And that's what he talked about in 2009. I'll fight for Virginia families that depend on coal for their jobs and for the utility bills. I mentioned the coal industry in Southwest Virginia, but APCO is our second biggest utility in Virginia, behind Dominion. Dominion is one we're more familiar with in Northern Virginia. APCO serves over 500,000 families and customers from Charlottesville, Roanoke, on down to the North Carolina line, roughly speaking. And they're about 80% coal-fired electricity. And that's also one of the poorest parts of Virginia. A lot of people on fixed incomes, and so as the prices of electricity continue to rise quickly because of the assault on coal, they pay a particular price. And when we're trying to bring manufacturing back to that part of Virginia, coal is a critical element. And the reason is electricity is such an important component of manufacturing. If we're going to see manufacturing, customized manufacturing, specialized manufacturing, which is coming back to a certain degree in Southside, if we're going to see that trend continue and really grow, which is what we need and what they need, we need long-term, reliable electricity prices. And that is going to require pushing back on the war on coal. And of course, as I touched on, I'll also continue the research efforts in Virginia to look at more clean coal technology and ways to utilize it more effectively. Give you one example. The newest coal plant built in Virginia in Wise County uses different technology and burns the same coal much more cleanly to obtain the same amount of energy. It represents a substantial advance. It's one of the cleanest coal plants in the whole country. Also, this past session, took a year and a half to get it, but I got an electricity bill passed on a bipartisan basis. Republicans and Democrats supported it. It opened the market to competition for electricity production. So-called NUGs, non-utility generators, were effectively disadvantaged versus APCO and Dominion, who got bonuses that you paid and our businesses paid through an artificial transfer of wealth to build all sorts of different things, like really everything eventually got bonuses, as they were called, adders, whether it was coal-fired or landfill gas, or the list goes on. Everything kept getting added to the list. But non-utility generators, competitors on the open market, didn't get those bonuses, didn't get those adders. So the utility companies were artificially incentivized to build this themselves instead of to utilize people who specialize in providing this kind of power and can do it more cost effectively, so all of our electric bills would be lower and we'd be more competitive for business in Virginia. Now compare that effort, and as I said, that took a year and a half to accomplish because there is a great deal of challenge when you bring an electricity bill. You've got to really convince people. And we put experts together and did exactly that. Now my opponent has supported a 25% mandatory renewable portfolio standard by 2025 in the past. Well, what does that mean in English? That means 1/4 of our electricity in Virginia coming from sources like solar, geothermal, wind, and so forth. Well, these are the kind of policies that are being pursued in some states and by some governments that are failing miserably, destroying jobs, and cranking up the price of electricity. Those are job-killing policies. My opponent likes to talk about all these obscure and unrelated things to business, connect them to me, and say that'll keep business out of Virginia. You want to keep business out of Virginia? adopt a 25% mandatory renewable portfolio standard like he opposes. That is a job-killing proposal. You know, he's well supported by the unions. You want to kill jobs? Bring them on in here to Virginia. You want to kill jobs? He didn't think the federal health care bill went far enough. He wanted a full single payer. Over 40% of small businesses aren't hiring or expanding just because of that regulation. Those are job-killing policies. And he's got one here in the energy area, and it's this mandatory RPS. Government doesn't have any business picking winners and losers as we were, and I successfully helped move us away from that. And it's important to note that at least some people in the Sierra Club supported getting rid of those adders because they artificially incentivize our utilities without any environmental benefit that any of us could discern. So when you think of the trade-off, we weren't trading off anything. We were just funneling money to what amounted to a special interest. So I also believe as we push offshore in the long term, especially as it relates to natural gas, that will also help the stability and the stability of our electricity prices and keeping them low.
Great. You know, you mentioned the offshore. Here in Virginia, we have overwhelming public support, 80% in recent polls. And Governor McDonnell has made this a top-tier priority for his administration to get access and leases going, as well as seismic activity in the Mid-Atlantic region. Yet the federal government has continued to slow roll this process, and unfortunately, we frankly are no further along in terms of opening up the Atlantic for either exploration or development than we were 4 years ago. As governor, what steps would you take to push the federal government when it comes to seismic and leasing?
Well, we certainly have substantial energy reserves offshore that could provide thousands of jobs, billions of dollars in investment, and millions more in tax revenue. And there's bipartisan congressional support, not just good polling, for moving in these directions, taking the exploration steps, doing the seismic work, moving the leases along. I support that and will aggressively support that. Virginians need a governor with a proven track record of fighting Washington, D.C. when they stand in the way in this fashion, when they overregulate, when they block us from moving ahead with opportunities. That's very important. I have a track record right up here in Northern Virginia with Fairfax County's Democrat Board of Supervisors as my co-plaintiff in the most recent lawsuit I had with the EPA, which we won, saving Virginia taxpayers and Fairfax taxpayers approximately $250 million. You've got to be willing to fight sometimes. There are times to work together, and building that coalition among our congressional delegation, for instance, is very important. But when Washington draws lines, Virginia needs leaders who will push and push across them, or we're not going to get this opportunity opened up to us. This is where the fact that I'm running against a guy who's a Washington insider and a Virginia outsider matters. That's what the Washington Post called him, a Virginia outsider and a Washington insider. He's not going to fight Washington. I've got a track record of doing that. We can do drilling in Virginia. If we get to that point, we can do it safely. The formation of the Center for Offshore Safety is a private industry effort that has come up with good best management practices for safe drilling offshore. We all watched the disaster in the Gulf and have been closely attuned to the development of new well capping technologies. But we also don't drill as deeply, wouldn't have to drill as deeply off Virginia's coast as they do in the Gulf, which makes us safer and more reliable anyway. As recently as 2009, my opponent vehemently opposed offshore drilling for oil. You cannot trust him on this issue.
Great. You also mentioned federal regulations and the burdens that they're placing on energy consumers here in Virginia. What steps as governor would you take, given that the federal government is supposed to give these states deference in terms of federal regulations and programs that it puts together? What steps as governor would you take to ensure Virginia's role in energy development?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure the federal government hasn't lost the memo that told them that states have a role in all of this. And that is a challenge that we have across the Potomac all the time. Federal regulations are our single biggest barrier to job creation. Single biggest barrier. And they're preventing Virginia from developing reliable and affordable sources of energy. EPA regulations on coal, whether it's the cross-state air rule, whether it's the so-called mercury and air toxic standards, mercury has less than 1% to do with that standard. Less than 1%. This all hits our coal industry, and it is slowly crushing it on a regulatory basis. Now, coal is suffering economic competition from natural gas. We want that kind of competition. We want that kind of free market competition taking place. That is best for electricity consumers, for energy consumers, to have that kind of competition going on. But the intentional regulatory destruction of these industries, and we've all watched, a few years ago, frankly, the radical left environmentalist lobby talked about getting rid of the coal industry and moving over to gas. Well, now that they see that end in sight, they're talking about getting rid of natural gas too. And while we're not North Dakota and we're not Pennsylvania, we do have gas in Virginia. Coal bed methane is the most commonly known one in Virginia. That is also an industry that is important to us. And the President Obama's administration and Terry McAuliffe's war on coal has been a major cause of the decline of coal nationally. It's been a significant contributing factor, and that includes right here in Virginia. Terry McAuliffe has spoken in the past about preventing another coal plant from being built in Virginia. And as I said, in Virginia, that war on coal is a war on our poor. They don't have a lot of other options. You know, I use the analogy to federal contractors in Northern Virginia, which we can sort of laugh about, because the reason we laugh about it is because we know it's outrageous. You never do anything like that. But as a proportion of our economy in Northern Virginia, it's not a bad apples to apples comparison. The difference in Northern Virginia is we have other industries. Those poor folks don't have other alternatives. And, you know, there are people in Washington who do not care. They don't care. We need a governor who cares about it. And this is about people. This is ultimately about people.
Excellent. Thank you. And please thank Ken. Again, as we did earlier, we will have Ken is available to take a few questions about